All right, hello U.S. history students. So I'm recording this video quickly here. I'm feeling a little under the weather and I just want to have a quick recording of this to have in my back pocket in the event that I can't be with you. So this is a video to start off Unit 5, a lesson to start off Unit 5 about the period of Reconstruction. And what's being reconstructed is the United States in the wake of the Civil War. It's an enormous project, and it's one we're going to study for a couple lessons here, 5.1 and 5.2. And I think in the end, if you're looking at this project that lasted, 10, 12 years, you'd have to say there were some aspects in which maybe we did an all right job, in which restoration work really did occur and some healing occurred. And then there's other important aspects in which we fumbled this job, and the project was left incomplete. And the true meaning of restoration and reconstruction was going to just be delayed for much longer than perhaps it ought to have been. So that's what this period's about. Okay, like putting the country back together, and at the center of it are kind of a cluster of knotty problems that are really difficult to unspool, and that don't really have. There's nothing in the Constitution that lays out here's how you solve that, and there's very little in terms of historical precedent about a democratic nation in the wake of a civil war trying to kind of put itself back together again in a healthier and a truer way than it was before. So among those problems, like how do Southern states rejoin the Union? How is that going to work, right? How do you take these states that have seceded? In the case of South Carolina, they've been itching to secede for a long, long time, right? And they've made war against the United States. Do you just sort of let them back in and slap them on the back and say, hey, some war, huh? Good job. Or do they need to say they're sorry a million times? Or are there some major changes that they have to agree to, perhaps? Like how's that going to work? What will be, how do we put this war truly behind us and sort of reconcile the two halves of the country? What is going to be the status of African Americans, right? Slavery is over. Glory, hallelujah, that's done. So that question's off the table. But what we're asking now is, for these freedmen, as they were called, free African Americans, are they equal citizens? Like, are they equal to their white neighbors? Are they some sort of second-tier citizen, like sort of in a category below? Do they have the right to vote? Can they vote? Can they serve on a jury? How does this work exactly? What is their status? What role will Southern states themselves play in determining that? And how much oversight is going to be necessary? How much is the federal government going to have to kind of grab the steering wheel for the Southern states and drive things for them? And for how long, in order for these changes to really take place in a meaningful way? And so, you can start to consider which strike you as most difficult, most important, what's going to be hardest. I'd say it's important to note that a lot of these are tied together. What is not helping is that while we have these enormous problems laid in front of us, we have an extremely dysfunctional period, political period. Now, it was dysfunctional before the war, and now there's sort of a whole different kind of dysfunction now. So at the center of the federal government sits the president, right? And we have the wrong president for this moment. Andrew Jackson is his name, and you'll recall that Andrew Jackson is president because Abraham Lincoln has been assassinated. You might remember that, Andrew Johnson is his name. Andrew Jackson is dead. That's a different guy. My apologies. So Andrew Johnson is president, and Johnson was made Lincoln's vice president during the 1864 reelection, when some Republican strategist guy thought it'd be neat to have a Southerner as vice president as a symbol of national reconciliation. And maybe that was neat. I don't know. I hope everybody enjoyed the neatness of it, because now we've got a mess on our hands. Johnson is he is a Southerner, right? He doesn't particularly like the Northerners and the Reformers who are trying to kind of like lead this Reconstruction process. He was fine with slavery going away. Johnson opposed secession, so it's not like he's like a Confederate. Let's be clear, he wasn't a Confederate, but he he was sort of sympathetic to the Southerner, and Johnson in his mind sees himself as Andrew Jackson. That's where my mistake came in. So like, when Johnson looks in the mirror, he says, I'm Andrew Jackson, right? I fight for the common man. I stand up for the common man against the interests of the entrenched elite. And for him, the entrenched elite was, in the old days, it was sort of the Southern planter class who he really didn't like. But these days, the entrenched elite to him meant Northern elitist Republicans and business interests there. The Republicans who run Congress have a president who is ostensibly a Republican, but who just sort of sees himself in a battling mode with them. And Johnson loved to battle with people. He was a quarrelsome and stubborn dude. We just got to put this one on the table. Andrew Johnson is noteworthy as I write, like maybe our most defiantly racist president ever. Now, there have been other times and other presidents who've harbored, plenty of whatever racist ideas, and I'm not saying that's good. I'm just saying it wasn't necessarily central to their function as president. But look, the central questions of Reconstruction have to do with the status of African Americans. And Andrew Johnson is there saying, over my dead body, am I going to allow the federal government to make moves that proclaim that black people are the legal equals of white people? He says, I'm going to obstruct that as much as I can. I'm going to put everything I can in the way to prevent that from happening. And so that is not a great fit for this political moment. It is just a key element of the dysfunction of this period. Now, the people that Johnson's doing battle with are the people who have a great deal of influence in Congress, and these are radical Republicans. So the radical Republicans are, look, the Republican Party is dominant in Congress because when the southern states all seceded and the Democratic Party was a little bit more affiliated with the South and with slavery, and so when they all secede, then Republicans are primarily the big party left in Congress, and they're calling the shots. Radical Republicans are one faction of the Republican Party. What makes them radical is they want to push for full political and legal equality for African Americans. And they say, and if we don't do that, if we don't put up a fight for that, then so much of the sacrifice of the Civil War will not have been worth it, right? To simply end slavery but leave African Americans as a sort of a perpetual second class or second tier citizen in the United States is still not meeting that declaration we made at the start of the Declaration of Independence. And so, look, there's plenty to admire about the radical Republicans. It's also clear there is like desire to have vengeance or retribution toward the South is not an incidental part of their kind of political recipe, and they have no real qualms about being too harsh on the South or going too far against the South. I don't think they really think that would be much of a problem, and so that's the radical Republicans, and Johnson sees himself as trying to thwart or stop these guys, and these guys look at Johnson and say, you shouldn't be president anyway. It's a mistake, a terrible accident that you are president, and we'll be darned if we're going to let you obstruct us at this crucial moment in history. So they're eager to try to grab hold of the federal government and steer Reconstruction in a direction that they see fit. I want you to sort of what are you making of this dysfunction that's going on here? There's a scrapbook slide, by the way, that goes along with this lesson. It's the second slide. President Johnson and radical Republicans. This is the center of the dysfunction of this period, so I want you to slow down and consider that. When we consider reformers like the radical Republicans here, or any of the progressive reformers we'll look at later, the temperance movement, any other different reform movements, we always want to be asking a couple key questions that help us move forward in sort of assessing that. Is this a reform movement that helps the United States move toward its central promise and move toward its actualizing its core values, our core values, or is it undermining those core values or trying to replace those core values? That would be a reason to be skeptical. Or is this reform movement aligned with biblical justice, at which point we as Christians should support it, should speak up, right? Or would it be undermining biblical justice, at which point we need to hold back? In the mix, we also have Southern Democrats. Now, again, Southern Democrats are kind of sitting in the naughty corner politically. They're out of power, but they're around. And Southern Democrats, what they're hoping for, what they want in this story, what they want at this moment is quick readmission back into the Union with as few questions asked as possible, right? They're willing to say, sorry about secession, and we let go of our slaves. Now, let's just drop it there and let us back in and sort of with full participation back in the United States of America. And the questions that they did not want to probe or that they wanted to deflect from were trying to elevate the status of African Americans legally and politically in the United States. They wanted nothing to do with that, which is what's behind this like really kind of reprehensible propaganda like we're looking at here, where they're saying the Democrats care about the white people and Republicans only care about the black people, right? So this is a move to Southern whites saying this is the party that's going to stand up for you. So the Southern Democrats are also in the mix. Again, they're not the loudest voice in the room. They don't have a ton of power, but they're around. This is a dysfunctional dynamic. When you analyze this, here, let me get my cursor over here. This is a chart I made to maybe help us understand. There's two axes here, right? The first axis has to do with leniency toward the South. And if it's all the way up at the top, that would mean, you're just in favor of like, hey, let them go, let the Southern states do what they want, let them back in, and we're happy to have you back. And all the way down here would be sort of a full military, maintaining a military presence in the South until they agree to changes X, Y, and Z. Now, as we'll learn, a lot of those changes X, Y, and Z have to do with the question of racial equality, right? So again, slavery is off the table now because of the 13th Amendment, but should African Americans be some sort of permanent second-class status in the United States? Should that be the new normal, or should they be full political equals to everybody else and have government muscle there to back that up and ensure that it happens? So you would plot Southern Democrats up here during Reconstruction and radical Republicans down here, and there's like a Grand Canyon of difference in between. Now, if we're trying to look at some individual people, let's put Andrew Johnson right here. Johnson certainly on the racial equality question would be on the left end of the spectrum there. And he wasn't quite as lenient as Southern Democrats would want it to be toward the South, but he was certainly much more eager to be lenient than radical Republicans were. Lincoln, it's hard to say because he died at this point, but we'd plot him somewhere over here or maybe further along this line. And Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, who will become president soon, would be over in this direction as well. All right, guys, part 2 of our lesson video. Sorry about the pause. I had to step out to go to a meeting. All right, so what I want to do for a moment is focus on our freedmen. This, roughly 4 million slaves that have just been freed in the South. What becomes of them in the immediate aftermath of the war? And by that, I just mean within the first, 5 years of the war. What happens to this whole class of people? What is offered to them besides freedom? Now, freedom is a beautiful thing. It's extremely important. I don't want to minimize and say they only got freedom. I mean, freedom's a big deal. But what beyond that? Because, it's a fair question to say if they're only offered freedom, is that truly justice being done? Is that truly an extension of biblical justice? Or is that truly creating a fair situation or an equal situation if a people has been, enslaved for generations after generations, to just say, well, now you're not enslaved anymore, so good luck to you, right? So what was offered? Well, I'll say some things were offered, though not much in general. Congress, led by Republicans, moves to create what's called the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is a government program, a government organization that is designed to offer, it can help with job placement, it can offer food, clothing, healthcare, and education is probably the biggest thing to these freed slaves. Now, Andrew Johnson vetoes the Freedmen's Bureau when it's initially passed because, Andrew Johnson. But it exists for, 7 or 8 years. And you see in the picture here, there's not only African-American children being educated, but many former slaves, grown-ups being educated as well. The teachers in these freedmen's schools were virtually all Northerners who came down south. There were just virtually no Southerners who taught in these freedmen's schools. The Freedmen's Bureau was, again, it existed for a while. It never really was fully funded to the degree that it probably should have been. Southerners complained after a while that white people weren't eligible for these benefits or for these schools, and so they said it was unfair that whites, everybody, including whites, were being taxed for a program that only benefited African Americans. That argument strikes me as a little bit obtuse given the historical situation that was just literally immediately ended right before that. But that was the argument that was made, and at a certain point, the plug gets pulled. And it's fair for students like you and learners like I to just wonder, what's our reaction? Was this a necessary piece here at that time? Was this sufficient? How about for what are they going to do for work? Most freed slaves had one set of skills, and those were agricultural, right? You literally couldn't have been. It was illegal to educate slaves, and so their skills were agricultural, and so they're looking for agricultural work. But you're trying to find agricultural work. Ideally, you want your own farm, but you have no capital. You have nothing to get started with. And by the way, this wasn't just slaves, of course. This is plenty of poor whites who, in the wake of the war, were just their economic situation was devastated. So what did people in that spot do? Well, what most of them ended up doing was putting themselves in this situation called sharecropping. And sharecropping is pretty bleak. The American economic story is a pretty positive one. It's a pretty beautiful one in many, many respects. Sharecropping is about as bleak as it gets in the American story. So what sharecropping is take a person, and just for the sake of our argument here, let's just say it's a freedman. It's an African American person who's recently been liberated from slavery, and they want to farm, and so they go to a landowner and say, "Can I farm here on this land? Can I use some of your land to do my own farming?" And the landowner says, "Sure, you can, but that will be in exchange for a share of your crop, or your rent to farm my land will be that you will give me 50% of the harvested crop." That's a high price, but what are the choices you're going to make, right? And so then that sharecropper also, it's like the landowner says, "Do you have any, tools and equipment?" And sharecropper's like, "No." And so landowner says, "Well, then I'll loan it to you and you can pay me back. Do you have any seed?" "No, I don't have anything." "Well, then I'll loan it to you and you can pay me back. And I'll also build you some housing and you can pay me back," right? And so when I say pay them back, what it means is you got to give them the 50% of your crop as your rent. And then out of your 50%, you have to pay back the loans to buy tools, seed, equipment, and pay rent or build housing, all that other stuff. The landowners were also able to pick what would be grown. And almost always the landowners specified they wanted to grow cotton because cotton had the highest potential for profits. Problem is, cotton also had the highest potential for failure, or it had a higher potential for crop failure than just growing food. And if you're really poor, there is wisdom in just growing things that are edible, right? Because at least then you can be a subsistence farmer and you can provide for yourself. But if you're a sharecropper and you're bound by this contract to grow only cotton, then that means you also have to buy your food from someone else. And that includes their profit margin. And so food is more expensive than if you were just growing it yourself. It's just a miserable situation. It lasted for generations. If you were a person who had to introduce yourself as a sharecropper, if you're white or you're black, being a sharecropper meant you were dirt poor. Consider, why would sharecroppers accept miserable terms like that? That's a good question. I want you to just quietly consider that. All right. Now let's talk about Reconstruction let's step back into the big, broad picture, top-down understanding of what's going on in politics. Things got a little crazy starting after a couple years of Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson, while Congress was in recess in 1866, Andrew Johnson allowed most of the southern states to come on back in with an apology for secession and a couple other paper-thin promises, but that was it. And Republicans in Congress are furious with President Johnson for doing this.
And in 1866, they get this, the Republicans win in a landslide. And so now they've got this veto-proof majority. There's so many of them that they can just start ignoring President Johnson, and they do. And the radicals say it's time to really impose our will on the South to make sure that these reforms and changes that we want with regard to civil rights actually happen. Because right now we're getting the sense that these Southern states are hell-bent on making African Americans like second-tier, second-class citizens. And that includes emergence of things like the Ku Klux Klan, which I'll teach you about next time. And so when I say they locked down, what that means is more federal troops were sent into the South. The blue coat soldiers are being sent back into these Southern states. The Southern states are transitioned from being states, union states that are part of the Union of the United States, back to being what they called military districts, like you can see in this map. So the state of Georgia is not Georgia any longer. Now it's part of military district number 3, governed by some U.S. Army general. I mean, this is the most aggressive step taken by the federal government toward an American state during an ostensible time of peace that has ever happened. It's really aggressive. Southerners are howling in frustration, and radical Republicans are saying, we're going to do this until you agree to some serious changes with regard to the civil rights status of African Americans, right? And because we're not just going to give away a whole bunch of what we fought for and won, the changes of like sort of putting some actual teeth to the ideas in the Declaration of Independence. We're not just going to sort of give that away because you guys want to be states faster than we're going to let you. And so this move of radical Reconstruction, of like reconstituting states as military districts, is aggressive. It lasts for a while. Consider, are you, as I'm describing this, are you saying, oh my gosh, the Republicans were going too far? Or are you someone that listens to this and says, I don't know, good. I'm glad our federal government is finally putting up a fight for the cause of civil rights and finally doing something about this. How are you responding here? You might say, well, how could Southern states get their statehood restored after this? Well, among other things, they were required to ratify or approve the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So remember, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment says all citizens of the United States are entitled to full and equal protection under the laws. There is no tiers of citizenship in the United States. There is one class of citizenship. Everyone in that category of United States citizen gives full and equal protection under the law. And that begs the question, then, well, who's a citizen, right? And the 14th Amendment describes this really cleanly and clearly and says anyone born here is a citizen. Anyone born under the jurisdiction of the United States is a citizen of the United States and entitled to the full and equal protection under the laws. We're not going to make clauses about race, religion, any of this other stuff. If you're born here, you're a citizen, the end. This amendment is enormously important in American history. It becomes the basis of any number of like lawsuits and Supreme Court cases as they're trying to decide, did this people group or that people group receive full protection under the law, like the 14th Amendment promises? Some people don't like the clause that says that anyone who's born here is a citizen. The reason that language is in there is because they're trying to make it as clear as day that you can't sort of describe this away in some sort of racial terms or some religious terms and exclude certain groups from citizenship. They're trying to say, if you are here with us, then you're a citizen. By the way, you can also become a citizen by becoming naturalized. You take the class and you do the oath, and that's fun stuff too. But that's I just want to make that clear. It's not the only way to become a citizen. The 15th Amendment, which comes shortly afterwards, is trying to specify, it adds into the Constitution language that says, you can't prevent someone from voting based on their race. And this sounds like a very big deal, and it is a very big deal in many ways. Unfortunately, it's just a little bit leaky. I'm going to demonstrate to you in lesson 5.2 that Southern states find ways to prevent blacks from voting without pointing explicitly to race. And we'll talk about why they did that and the emergence of Jim Crow segregation. That's coming up soon enough. But this 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we call them the Civil Rights Amendments because they all relate to the massive changes in the United States in the wake of the Civil War. And again, that thought of putting some constitutional teeth and muscle behind the notion that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? We proclaim that at the outset, and now we're adding some constitutional muscle. And this sounds like where it's just like, Reconstruction is going positively and everything seems like it's on the up and up, and you can be forgiven for thinking that. But what I'm going to tell you in lesson 5.2 is that the ground is going to give way on a lot of this stuff in ways that is discouraging, but it's part of our story. It's part of what we got to grapple with. So that's it for this lesson. Thank you guys so much for your good work. Sorry I couldn't be there, and we will talk soon. Bye.